He came prepared to humiliate her on live television, but by the time Karoline Leavitt was done, the entire studio sat in stunned silence. Karoline was no stranger to tough interviews. She had faced pointed questions, weathered hostile debates, and stood firm against conversations designed to shake her. But something about this one felt different. A week earlier, she had received the invitation, an appearance on a high-profile news program. Not just any program, but one notorious for its confrontational style, where guests weren't merely questioned but cornered. The host, Richard Caldwell, was a seasoned journalist with a reputation for belittling younger guests, especially those who didn't align with his worldview. Karoline had done her research. Caldwell had built his career on sharp-tongued takedowns, exposing guests he deemed unqualified. His strategy was simple: provoke, discredit, and if necessary, humiliate. This wasn't about conversation, it was about control. And tonight, Karoline was his target. She could already hear the criticisms before even stepping onto the set. Too young, too inexperienced, too ambitious for her own good. The labels didn't bother her. What did was the arrogance of men like Caldwell, who believed a smirk and a raised eyebrow were enough to rattle her. From the moment she arrived at the studio, she felt the unspoken condescension. The producer, a man in his mid-50s, greeted her with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. A young assistant offered a hesitant nod but avoided eye contact. Everything about the atmosphere made one thing clear: she wasn't expected to win this exchange. But Karoline wasn't here to play by their expectations. As she sat in the makeup chair, she barely registered the stylist brushing powder over her. "Jace." She could hear Caldwell's voice from the adjacent set, wrapping up his current segment. Calm, confident, the voice of a man who had spent years controlling the conversation. The stylist adjusted the collar of Karoline's blazer. "You ready?" Karoline met her own gaze in the mirror. She didn't need to answer. Minutes later, she was led into the studio. The lights were blinding, the air unnaturally cold. The audience, composed mostly of journalists and industry insiders, sat just beyond the cameras, silent, waiting. Caldwell was already in his chair, legs crossed, a practiced smile on his face. Not a welcoming smile, but a challenging one. His fingers drummed against the desk as she took her seat. "Karoline Leavitt," he said, stretching out her name as if testing its weight. "Welcome to the show," she nodded. "Thanks for having me." His eyes flickered, scanning her, measuring how much resistance she'd put up. Then he leaned forward slightly, his smirk barely concealed. "You've made quite a name for yourself in a short time. Some might say too fast for someone with so little experience." Karoline met his gaze unfazed. She had expected this, the veiled insult disguised as an observation, the attempt to plant doubt from the first sentence. "I believe experience comes from action, not just years," she said evenly. Caldwell let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if amused. But isn't that what every young upstart says before realizing they're in over their head?" There it was, the first attempt to make her shrink, to second-guess herself. She didn't blink. But Caldwell wasn't done. He tilted his head, fingers tapping the desk in mock curiosity. "I have to ask, do you really believe you've earned a seat at this table? Or is this just another case of someone trying to skip the hard work and go straight for the spotlight?" The air in the studio shifted. This wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a battle. But Karoline had never been one to back down from a fight. Caldwell leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes locked on her like a predator sizing up its prey. The studio felt colder now, the tension thick. Karoline knew his tactic: establish dominance early, put the guest on the defensive. She adjusted her posture, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I don't believe success has a set timeline," she said. "If someone is competent, driven, and prepared, why should they have to wait their turn?" Caldwell smirked, shaking his head slightly. But for the first time, there was something else in his expression. He wasn't as sure of his control as he had been moments before. That's the thing about younger generations. Always in a rush. Caldwell's voice carried the familiar weight of condescension. You talk about preparation, but let's be honest, experience matters, and frankly, many would argue that you haven't paid your dues. A faint chuckle came from off-camera. A producer, probably. They were expecting her to stumble. She didn't. I think the idea of paying dues is often used to keep people in their place, Karoline said, her tone even. What exactly are we talking about? A waiting period? An arbitrary number of years before someone's opinion is valid? Because I don't think the world works that way anymore. Caldwell's smirk twitched. He had expected a rehearsed, polished response, something predictable, easy to counter. Instead, she had given him something he couldn't immediately dismiss. He shifted in his chair. That sounds convenient, he said, his tone laced with condescension. But let's be real. People don't just wake up one morning and suddenly deserve a platform. It takes time, hard work, and frankly, wisdom that comes with age. Karoline let a brief silence stretch between them. Not long enough to be awkward, just enough to let his words settle. Wisdom comes from experience, she said. But experience isn't just about age. It's about what you do with the opportunities you have. Some people spend decades in a field and never push beyond the surface. Others come in and through sheer work ethic, insight, and innovation, make an impact almost immediately. Caldwell let out a quiet chuckle. And I assume you put yourself in that second category? She tilted her head slightly. I'll let my work speak for itself. For a split second, something flickered in Caldwell's expression, a hint of irritation. She wasn't playing into his game, but he wasn't done yet. He leaned forward, lowering, his voice slightly. All right then, let's talk about credibility. Some would say that in today's world, it's dangerously easy to build a following without actually knowing what you're talking about. Social media amplifies voices that, in past generations, might have been ignored for a reason. A murmur rippled through the studio. The audience wasn't just watching now, they were invested. Karoline's heartbeat stayed steady. She saw exactly where he was trying to steer the conversation. Undermine her credibility. Paint her as a product of the digital age rather than someone who had earned her place. She didn't flinch. I think it's funny how people in power always say that, right up until the moment someone younger outperforms them, she said smoothly. Then, suddenly the conversation isn't about skills, facts, or results. It's about credibility. The goalposts move. Caldwell's smirk didn't fade, but it felt forced now. So, you're saying expertise doesn't matter? Not at all, she countered. I'm saying expertise isn't exclusive to people who've been doing the same thing the same way for decades. Sometimes the ones asking new questions are the ones actually moving things forward. Caldwell inhaled slowly, exhaling through his nose. His next move was clear. He needed to regain control of the conversation. But Karoline had just shifted the balance of power, and she wasn't letting it go. He straightened in his chair, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from his sleeve. His usual tactics weren't working, and he knew it. The playful smirk had faded, replaced by something more measured. He wasn't done trying to dismantle her, but now he had to be more careful. So let's talk specifics, he said, folding his hands. You've positioned yourself as a strong voice in your field. But when we look at your background, there's a noticeable lack of, shall we say, traditional credentials. No decades of experience. No long list of past leadership positions. So why should anyone trust your perspective over those who do have that kind of history? Karoline heard the unspoken words. You don't belong here. You haven't earned this. She kept her expression steady. I think people trust results, she said simply. When someone is effective, when they produce meaningful work, people notice. That's true whether you've been in the game for 2 years or 20. Caldwell exhaled sharply through his nose, a half laugh, half scoff. Results? Let's be honest. Public attention doesn't always mean quality. We've seen plenty of people gain influence for the wrong reasons. Karoline nodded, as if she had been expecting this. Absolutely. But if someone stays relevant, if people consistently turn to them for insight, if their work holds up over time, That's when you know it's real. A few lucky breaks won't sustain someone in the long run. Real impact does. Caldwell's mouth twitched again. He was running, out of angles. And this time Karoline saw it for what it was. Frustration. She wasn't taking the bait. She wasn't fumbling. She wasn't playing the defensive role he had expected. But Caldwell wasn't giving up yet. "Okay," he said, shifting tactics. "Let's acknowledge the elephant in the room. The world has changed. We live in an era where opinions are thrown around carelessly, where facts are," he made air quotes, "interpreted however best suits the person saying them." He leaned in slightly. "Do you think it's possible that your confidence comes from the fact that up until now no one has really challenged you?" The audience fell silent, waiting for her response. Karoline let a beat pass before answering. "I think people confuse confidence with arrogance," she said, her tone even. "I've been challenged plenty. But being questioned by people who assume they already know better, that's not a real challenge." She paused, letting the words settle. "That's just gatekeeping." Caldwell blinked. The shift in his expression was subtle, but she caught it. She continued. "The real test isn't whether someone can challenge me. It's whether, when they do, I hold up under pressure." His fingers tapped against the desk. A quick, unconscious movement. He hadn't expected that answer. "All right," he said slowly. "So you believe that results and resilience speak louder than time served?" "I do." He exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly. "Then let's really put that resilience to the test." The tone of the conversation had changed. He was about to play his next card, and it was clear he had been saving it for this moment. But Karoline wasn't just holding her ground anymore. She was controlling the conversation. And Caldwell knew it. He adjusted his posture, planting both elbows on the desk. He wasn't smirking anymore. The easy, condescending amusement from earlier had been replaced with something colder, a calculated decision to strike harder. "All right," he said, his voice measured. "Since you're so confident in your own credibility, let's talk about why people question it." Karoline didn't respond right away. She knew better than to rush into a trap before she could see its full shape. Caldwell didn't wait. He pulled a sheet of paper from the stack in front of him, a prop meant to make what he was about to say feel less like an opinion and more like an undeniable fact. He scanned it briefly before looking back up at her. "You've been accused of pushing narratives that fit your personal agenda rather than sticking strictly to facts," he said. "Some critics have even suggested that you avoid certain details in your arguments because they don't support your perspective." A slight pause. Then, the question, "Would you say that's fair criticism?" Karoline didn't blink. This wasn't about her credentials anymore. Now, he was attacking her integrity. She tilted her head slightly. "I'd say that's an easy accusation to throw around when someone doesn't like what I have to say." Caldwell raised an eyebrow, as if amused. "So you're saying your critics just don't like you?" "No," she said calmly. "I'm saying that when people don't have a strong argument against the substance of what I say, they attack the messenger instead. It's a classic deflection tactic." Caldwell let out a slow breath through his nose. "A deflection tactic," he repeated. "So when people claim you've ignored inconvenient facts, they're just making that up." Karoline leaned forward slightly. "Here's the thing," she said. "Every discussion has multiple angles. I focus on the parts that are most relevant to my point, just like you do, just like every journalist does." She let that settle for a moment. "That's not deception, that's framing. And if someone thinks I left out something important, they're free to bring it up. I'll address it." Caldwell's fingers curled slightly around the edge of the paper. He had expected her to flinch, to scramble for a defense. Instead, she was meeting him head-on. He tried again. "All right, but let's take this beyond just framing. You've built a platform on confidence, on the idea that you have answers. But what happens when you're wrong, Zars?" Way he said it made it clear what he wanted. Hesitation, a moment of doubt, a flicker of uncertainty for the audience to latch onto. Karoline didn't give him one. Of course I've been wrong before, she said easily. That's part of learning, but here's the difference. When I realize I'm wrong, I don't double down to save face. I correct it and move forward. Caldwell's jaw tightened, just slightly, before he forced another smirk. And yet some people say you never acknowledge your mistakes. Karoline smiled. Just a little. Some people say a lot of things, she said. That doesn't make them true. The audience chuckled, not at her, at him. The balance of the conversation had shifted again, and he could feel it. Caldwell tapped the paper against the desk, exhaling. He wasn't out of moves yet, but Karoline could see it now, the frustration beneath the surface. So let's get this straight, he said, voice carefully measured. You're young, outspoken. You challenge conventional wisdom. And yet you think none of the criticism against you holds weight? Karoline shook her head slightly. That's not what I said, she replied. I think criticism is valuable, but not all criticism is honest. Some of it comes from people who just don't want to hear a perspective that challenges their own. Caldwell opened his mouth, but she wasn't finished. And let's be real, she continued. People in your position, her gaze locked onto him, steady, unwavering, have spent years deciding who gets to be taken seriously and who doesn't. So when someone comes along and doesn't wait for permission, doesn't play by the old rules, you call it lack of credibility. But what you're really upset about is losing control of the conversation. A murmur spread through the audience. Caldwell's jaw shifted, just slightly. She had hit a nerve. But instead of backing down, he forced another tight smile. He had one. Last play left. A desperate one. Then let's talk about control, he said. His voice was even, but there was an edge to it now. Because right now, you're sitting in a seat that a lot of people don't think you deserve. And I have to ask, what happens when they're right? The studio fell silent. It was a direct challenge, a final push to knock her off balance. But Karoline had never been more steady. The audience, the crew, even the off-camera panelists who had been murmuring before. Everyone was waiting. Karoline met his gaze. Steady, unshaken. That's the real question, isn't it, she said. Not whether I'm competent, not whether my arguments hold up, but whether I deserve to be here. That's what this has been about from the start. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, latching onto the word. Exactly, he said. Because there's a difference between being loud and being qualified, between being popular and actually earning respect. Karoline exhaled softly through her nose, not frustration, something closer to amusement. She wasn't rattled. If anything, she looked stronger than she had at the start. Respect isn't given, Richard, she said. It's taken. The weight of those 3 words landed. Caldwell's smirk faltered for half a second before he recovered. Karoline continued, her voice unwavering. You talk about qualifications, but let's be honest, a lot of people in positions of power didn't earn their spot either. They were born into the right family, knew the right people, said the right things to the right audience, and you never questioned whether they deserved to be there. She let that sink in. But when someone like me, who built their own platform, who didn't wait for permission, comes along, suddenly it's about qualifications. The audience shifted. Some nodded. A few murmured. Caldwell crossed his arms. So you think you're above criticism? No, Karoline answered instantly. I think criticism should be fair. And the reality is, people like me will always be held to a different standard. We're expected to be twice as sharp, twice as prepared, twice as perfect, just to get half the respect. And when we still manage to prove ourselves, the goalposts move. Caldwell's jaw tensed. Karoline didn't stop. You call it arrogance, she said. I call it not waiting to be given a seat at a table that was never built for me. Another murmur from the audience. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a reckoning. Caldwell exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. That's a strong answer, he admitted. But confidence isn't proof. If you're wrong about something, are you willing to admit it? Karoline gave a small nod. Absolutely. But being questioned by people who've already made up their mind about me, that's not the same thing as being wrong. Caldwell didn't move. For the first time in the entire interview, he had nothing to say. The silence stretched, and the audience could feel it. The shift. The unraveling of the narrative Caldwell had been trying to control. Karoline watched him, waiting. Nothing. No smirk, no comeback. Just silence. The cameras captured it all. Finally, Caldwell let out a slow breath. He glanced at his notes, flipping a page, then set them down. The energy in the room had changed, and he knew it. Karoline did too. She had won. The studio remained still. The weight of her words had settled into every corner of the room, leaving an undeniable tension in its wake.